She was a doctor. She had saved lives on 3 continents. She had stood before 300 specialists in Paris and made them all stand up. She had earned every penny of that first-class ticket with years of night shifts, being the only Black woman in every room she entered, swallowing her dignity so silently that the people around her didn't even notice. And the moment she sat down in that seat, a man snapped his fingers at a flight attendant and said he didn't want to sit next to her. He didn't whisper. He didn't have the decency to be ashamed of it. He said it loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. His wife recoiled from Keisha as if she were something unpleasant on the floor, and everyone in that first-class cabin looked away and said nothing. But there was one man who didn't look away. He was sitting directly across the aisle, still as a statue, a black suit, no tie, and dragons tattooed on his neck in dark ink. No one on that plane knew his name yet, but in certain rooms in Seoul, Tokyo, and Shanghai, that name made people hold their breath. He was the last person anyone would expect to stand up for a Black woman on a commercial flight. And what he did next silenced the entire plane. But what no one knew, not the cowardly passengers, not the trembling flight attendant, not even Keisha herself, was the real reason he stood up. And when the truth came out, somewhere over the Pacific, at an altitude of 10,670 meters, it broke something that had been sealed for 3 years. Before we begin the story, comment here where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The cabin smelled of recycled air and expensive cologne. Keisha Williams had noticed that about first class, the way wealth had its own particular scent, something between leather and restraint. She had pressed her nose against enough economy windows over the years to know the difference. And tonight, for the first time in her 29 years of life, she was on the other side of that curtain. She adjusted her blazer, camel-colored, tailored, purchased on a Tuesday afternoon in Paris after she had spent 6 hours presenting her research on pediatric cardiac emergencies to an audience of 300 specialists who had applauded her work standing up. She had cried in the bathroom afterward, not from joy, but from the specific exhaustion of always having to be twice as precise, twice as composed, twice as certain before anyone in a room like that would lean forward and actually listen. The flight from Seoul to Sao Paulo was 14 hours. She had chosen the window seat deliberately. She wanted to watch the world shrink below her, wanted to feel, just once, that she was the kind of person who moved through the sky at 35,000 feet without apologizing for the space she occupied. She tucked her cognac bag under the seat in front of her, the white lab coat folded neatly against the side pocket, a habit from her residency years that she had never been able to break, carrying it the way some people carry photographs, a reminder of who she was when the world forgot. She did not notice him at first. Jang Hyeon-Soo sat across the aisle in seat 3B, still as a man who had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power. He wore a black suit with no tie, 2 buttons open at the collar, and the dragons on his neck, inked in a studio in Itaewon 17 years ago, each scale chosen deliberately, each line a name he no longer spoke aloud, caught the faint overhead light as he turned a page of the slim novel in his hands. He was not reading it. He had not read a single word since boarding. He was watching, as he always watched, the way a man watches when survival has made observation into reflex. He had seen her walk in. He had seen the way she paused at the entrance of the cabin. Just half a second. The kind of pause no one notices unless they are trained to notice everything. And he had understood what that pause meant. It was the pause of someone who had learned to check whether they belonged before stepping into any room. His daughter used to do the same thing. Minji, 26 years old. She would have been 29 now, the same age as the woman settling into 3A with her folded white coat and her quiet, careful dignity. Minji had become a doctor against everything he had built his life around. He had tried, once, to tell her he was afraid for her, that the hours were brutal, that the world did not pay enough for what it cost the body. She had looked at him with those eyes that saw straight through whatever face he wore for the rest of the world and said, "Appa, I'm not doing it for the world. I'm doing it for the person in front of me." 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days ago, she had been driving home from a double shift at Seoul National University Hospital when a truck ran a red light at 4 in the morning. The driver had fallen asleep. Jang had made certain, quietly and thoroughly, that the driver never fell asleep again behind any wheel. It had brought him no peace whatsoever. He turned another page he did not read. Across the aisle, the couple in row 3 shifted. He noticed the man, 50s, British, the particular breed of confident that comes not from achievement, but from never once having been told no. Lean toward his wife and exchange a look. The wife's mouth tightened. She reached up and pressed the call button. Jang set the book on his knee. He did not move. He simply watched, with the patience of a man who had learned that the most dangerous moment is always the one just before action, and waited to see what kind of people they were going to be. The flight attendant arrived with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. She was young, early 20s, her uniform pressed with the kind of precision that suggested she was still in the phase of her career where she believed perfection of appearance could substitute for experience. Her name tag read, Soo-yeon. She had been flying international routes for 8 months. She was not prepared for Gerald Hartwell. "We'd like to be moved," he said, without lowering his voice. Not a request. The grammar of a request, but the tone of a man reading an invoice. "This arrangement isn't working for us." Soo-yeon blinked. "I apologize, sir. May I ask what the issue—" "The arrangement," Gerald repeated, slower this time. The way people repeat things to those they have already decided cannot understand them at normal speed. "Isn't working." His wife, Catherine, 51, pearls, the kind of woman who had confused elegance with agreement for so long she could no longer locate the difference, placed one hand flat on her armrest and turned her face toward the window, away from Kesha. Deliberately, completely, with the practiced ease of someone who had performed that particular disappearing act many times before. Kesha heard everything. She had her earphones in but had not pressed play. Another habit. A shield that looked like disengagement. She had learned it at 14, in a private school in Atlanta where she had been one of 3 black students in her year, where certain hallways had a way of going quiet when she entered them. You learned to look occupied. You learned to give people the comfort of believing you did not notice, because noticing made them uncomfortable, and their discomfort always, somehow, became your problem. Her hands were folded on her lap. She was looking at the seatback screen in front of her, at a flight map showing a small, animated plane suspended somewhere over the Yellow Sea. And she was doing the thing she had perfected over 29 years. She was becoming very, very still. Soo-yeon was explaining, quietly and with increasing distress, that the flight was at capacity, that there were no available seats in the first-class cabin, that she would see what could be arranged. Her voice had taken on the particular frequency of someone trying to de-escalate a situation they have not been trained to name correctly. General's voice did not lower. It rose. "I'm going to need someone more senior than you," he said, "because what I'm telling you is simple. We paid for this experience. We have certain expectations of this experience. And right now, those expectations are not being met. The word expectations landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. Several passengers looked up from their screens. A man in 2A, Korean, mid-50s, the build of someone who had once been athletic and still carried the posture, glanced over, and then immediately back at his laptop. The practiced neutrality of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided it was not his row. Soo-yeon's hands, Jang noticed, were trembling slightly at her sides. He noted the exact moment Keisha's shoulders changed. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. A slow, almost imperceptible descent. The way a building doesn't collapse all at once, but settles, millimeter by millimeter, under a weight it was never meant to carry. She was going to offer to move. He could see it forming in her posture before she had consciously decided it. She was going to make herself smaller to make them more comfortable, and she had done it so many times that her body had memorized the motion. He set his book on the empty seat beside him. He did not stand immediately. He buttoned the single button of his jacket. He adjusted his left cuff. He did these things slowly, with the deliberate calm of a man for whom urgency was a tool to be used on others, never on himself. Then he stood up. He did not say anything at first. He simply stood in the aisle, 6 feet of absolute stillness in a black suit, the dragons on his neck catching the light, and looked at Gerald Hartwell with the specific quality of attention that his associates in Seoul described, when they described it at all, as the moment before the room changes. Gerald turned, saw him. Something shifted in his face. Not quite recognition, not quite fear, but the animal awareness of a man whose instincts were telling him something his ego had not yet agreed to accept. "This," Jang said, in English that was quiet and entirely without accent, "is not a conversation I am going to allow you to continue." Gerald's jaw tightened. "I don't know who you think you—" "My name," Jang said, "is Jang Hyeon-Soo." He paused. 1 beat. 2. "You have a phone. The Wi-Fi on this aircraft is functional." "I will wait." He said it the way a man states a mathematical fact. No heat, no performance. The absolute zero of genuine threat. The cabin had gone silent in the way that spaces go silent when everyone present understands that something irreversible is about to happen, and no one is certain yet what shape it will take. Gerald picked up his phone. His wife watched his face as he read. She watched the color drain from it the way water drains from a glass that has developed a crack. Slowly at first, then all at once. Jang stood in the aisle and waited, patient as geology. 12:43. Gerald Hartwell had built his entire professional life on the architecture of intimidation. He had mastered the boardroom silence, the delayed email response, the meeting scheduled and then canceled at the last minute, the 1,000 small instruments of power that men like him wielded so naturally they had stopped recognizing them as weapons. He had fired people without looking up from his desk. He had ended careers over lunches that he expensed afterward. He was not, in any meaningful sense of the word, a coward. He simply had never, in 52 years of living, been in a room with something genuinely more dangerous than himself. The search results loaded slowly on his phone. A profile. A name. Cross-referenced articles in Korean, Japanese, 3 in English. One from a financial journal that described Jang Hyeon-Soo's logistics conglomerate as aggressively vertically integrated, which was the particular language financial journalists used when they suspected criminal infrastructure but could not yet prove it. One from an Interpol-adjacent watchdog organization that had been published and then, quietly, taken down. one from a South Korean newspaper that described, in careful and non-specific language, 3 separate instances in which business rivals of the Jang organization had experienced what the article called sudden and comprehensive reversals of fortune. There was a photograph. Jang at some public event, standing at the edge of a crowd the way predators stand at the edge of clearings, present, watchful, belonging to a different category of thing than everything around him. Gerald looked up from the phone, looked at the man standing in the aisle 3 feet away from him, looked back at the photograph. The color that had drained from his face did not return. Catherine touched his arm. He did not respond to it. Gerald began. You were going to collect your bag, Jang said. Still quiet, still without heat. The tone of a man describing something that had already happened. And speak to the flight attendant about alternative seating arrangements. In economy. The smallest pause. I believe there are seats available near the rear of the aircraft. It was not phrased as a suggestion. It was not phrased as a threat. It existed in the precise linguistic space between the two, which was, Jang had learned over many years, the most effective place for any sentence to exist. Gerald Hartwell stood up. He reached into the overhead compartment and retrieved his carry-on bag with hands that were not entirely steady. Catherine rose beside him without a word, her pearls catching the light, her face arranged into the expression of a woman who had decided, with great efficiency, that she had never been part of whatever had just occurred. They walked toward the rear of the aircraft without looking back. The cabin remained silent for a moment that stretched longer than silence usually does. Then, gradually, the small sounds of a pressurized tube carrying human beings through the upper atmosphere reassembled themselves. The hum of the engines, the faint percussion of someone's music leaking through inadequate earphones, the soft, mechanical sigh of the ventilation system. Soo-yeon stood very still near the galley curtain. Then she exhaled, straightened her jacket, and disappeared behind it. Jang returned to his seat. He did not look at Keisha. He picked up his book, found the page he had never been reading, and held it open on his knee. Keisha had not moved. She was still looking at the flight map on the screen in front of her, the small animated plane still suspended, still crossing the endless, dark geometry of open water. Her hands were still folded on her lap, but they were no longer trembling. She became aware, slowly, of something shifting inside her chest. Not relief, exactly. Something older than relief and more complicated. The specific sensation of having been witnessed by someone who did not need anything from her in return for the witnessing. She had not known, until this moment, how long she had been waiting for that particular thing. She did not turn to look at him immediately. She allowed herself 30 seconds of looking at the flight map, at the small plane moving across the dark, and she breathed. Then she turned. He was looking at his book. The dragons on his neck were still in the dim light of the cabin. His face was completely closed. Not cold, she realized, but sealed, the way a house is sealed when the person inside it is protecting something from the weather. She understood that expression. She had worn it herself for 29 years. Thank you, she said, quietly. Just the 2 words, without decoration. He did not look up immediately. He turned a page. Then, after a moment that felt precisely calibrated, he spoke. And what he said was not what she expected, which was nothing, or perhaps some small deflection, the social currency of people who do not want to be thanked because being thanked requires acknowledging that something happened. What he said was, "My daughter was a doctor. She used to fold her coat exactly the way you fold yours." Keisha looked down at her bag. at the white coat folded against the side pocket, the collar tucked under precisely, the sleeves crossed. A motion so automatic she performed it without awareness, had performed it 10,000 times in 10,000 corridors and departure gates and parking garages at 4 in the morning. She looked back at him. He had not looked up from the book. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man who has said something true in public for the first time in a very long time and is now managing the consequences of it. "Used to," Keisha said. Not a question. She was a doctor. She knew the grammar of loss. He turned another page he was not reading. 3 years ago, he said, she was driving home from a night shift. The engines hummed. The cabin breathed around them. Keisha did not say she was sorry. She had learned, over years of delivering impossible news in hospital corridors, that "I'm sorry" was sometimes the loneliest thing you could say to a person. It placed the grief back in their hands without sitting down beside it. Instead, she said nothing, and her silence was the kind that does not leave the room. They sat that way for a long moment, two people on opposite sides of a universe that had briefly, improbably, opened the door between them. The hours passed the way hours pass at altitude, without the usual markers of time, the light outside unchanging, the world below invisible, the cabin suspended in its own pressurized version of eternity. Keisha slept for a while, or something close to sleep, the kind of half-consciousness that long flights produce, where the body rests, but the mind continues its quiet inventory of everything it has survived. When she surfaced, the cabin was dark. Most passengers had reclined their seats and pulled their blankets into the shapes of small, temporary lives. The overhead lights had been dimmed to a blue-gray that made everything look like the bottom of a very calm ocean. Jang was awake. She knew without looking directly at him. The particular quality of his stillness was different from sleep, more intentional. The stillness of someone choosing to remain present, rather than someone who had drifted away from it. The book was closed on his knee. His hands were resting on top of it, the tattoos tracing their permanent record across his knuckles, and he was looking at something in the middle distance that existed only for him. She thought about Minji, a woman she had never met and never would, a woman who had folded her coat the same way, who had driven home from night shifts through the dark geography of a city that did not pause for its exhausted healers, who had looked at her father, this man whom the world classified as a monster, and whom financial journalists described in the careful, passive voice of the deeply frightened, and had seen something worth becoming a doctor in spite of. That told Keisha something. She was not certain yet what exactly, but it told her something. She reached into her bag and removed a small notebook, the kind she carried for conference notes, its cover soft from months of being opened and closed in the pockets of that same white coat. She found a blank page near the back. She wrote something. She tore the page out carefully along the margin, folded it once, and held it for a moment without moving. Then she leaned slightly across the aisle and placed it on the armrest beside him. He looked down at it. He did not pick it up immediately. Then he unfolded it with one hand, the motion precise and unhurried, and read what she had written. She had written, "She sounds like she was extraordinary. I think she would have been the kind of doctor I would have wanted beside me." He read it twice. She was not watching his face directly. She had given him the privacy of her peripheral vision, the same courtesy he had extended to her when he had said what he said about Minji without looking up from his book. But she saw, in that peripheral space, something move across his expression, something that was not the sealed house, something that was, briefly and with great difficulty, a window. He refolded the paper. He placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest. He did not say anything for a long time. Then, she would have argued with you about every diagnosis, he said. His voice was different now. Not softer, exactly, but less architectural, less constructed. The voice of a man rather than the voice of a position. She argued with everyone. She thought it was how you found the truth. She was right, Keisha said. Something that was almost, a smile crossed his face. It did not complete itself, but it was there for the half-second it existed, and it changed the entire geometry of his face into something that must have been, once, before the years and the choices and the weight of whatever empire he had built over the ruin of his grief. Something that people who loved him would have recognized immediately. It was gone before she could be certain she had seen it. They did not speak again for a long time after that. The plane moved through the dark. Below them, continents were happening. The slow, tectonic permanence of land that would outlast every person on the aircraft by geological orders of magnitude, that had watched empires build and collapse and build again without adjusting its posture. Keisha thought about what it meant to be protected by someone the world feared. She thought about how often the wrong people were afraid of the wrong things. She thought about Gerald Hartwell's face when the color left it, and she felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sadness, but existed in the complicated territory between them. The feeling of a justice that arrived from an impossible direction and therefore felt, somehow, both complete and deeply strange. She thought about how she had spent 29 years learning to disappear in rooms, and how tonight, for the first time, someone had looked across a room and seen her clearly enough to stand up. She thought about Min-ji, driving home in the dark, never knowing that her father would carry her folded into his chest for the rest of his life, the way Keisha carried her coat. The descent began the way descents always begin. Gradually, then with increasing commitment, the plane tilting its nose toward a world that had continued existing without them. The lights of Sao Paulo appeared below, the sprawling electric map of a city of 20 million people, each light a room, each room a life, each life a complete universe of consequence and love and loss that would never fully intersect with any other. Keisha pressed her forehead briefly against the window and looked down at all of it. When the plane landed and the cabin lights came back to full brightness and the ordinary sounds of arrival assembled themselves, the percussion of seatbelts, the exhalation of the pressure system, the automated voice explaining in 3 languages what everyone already knew, Jang Hyeon-Soo stood, buttoned his jacket with the same deliberate calm with which he had unbuttoned it hours ago, and retrieved his bag from the overhead compartment. He did not say goodbye. She had not expected him to, but before he moved into the aisle, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed something. He set it on the armrest beside her without looking at her. A white card, plain, no logo, no title. A phone number. And beneath it, in handwriting that was careful and slightly uncertain, the handwriting of a man writing in a language that was not his first. 3 words in Portuguese. Cuide de você. Take care of yourself. He was gone before she finished reading it. Keisha sat in seat 3A while the cabin emptied around her. She held the card in both hands. Outside the window, the ground crews were moving in the yellow light of the tarmac, small figures performing the ordinary choreography of arrival. And the sky above Sao Paulo was beginning, at its eastern edge, to consider the possibility of morning. She placed the card in her bag beside the folded white coat. She never called the number. She never threw the card away. It remained there, in the side pocket, through 100 subsequent night shifts and 100 subsequent mornings. A record of the night a man the world called dangerous had stood up in an airplane and reminded her that she was worth standing up for. She thought about it most on the hard nights. The nights when the weight of being always the only one in the room settled back onto her shoulders with the familiarity of something that had never really left. On those nights, she would reach into her bag for her coat, and her fingers would find the card, and she would think about a man sitting in the dark above the yellow sea, holding a book he was not reading, carrying a grief that had somehow, improbably, made him more human than any of the people around him who had never lost anything at all. And she would put on her coat and walk back into the hospital and stand in front of whoever needed her next. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was just easier now to remember it. If this story moved something inside you, take a moment and ask yourself honestly, have you ever been in that cabin? Not on a plane, but in a meeting room, a restaurant, a classroom. A place where you were made to feel like you didn't belong, and everyone around you chose to look away. And have you ever been surprised, truly surprised, by who finally stood up for you? Sometimes the person carrying the most pain is the one who recognizes yours first. Sometimes the one the world calls dangerous is the only one brave enough to be decent. Keisha never called that number. But she never let go of that card either. Because some moments don't need a follow-up. They just need to be kept. Tell us your story in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about dignity, redemption, and the unexpected grace of strangers, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.